Okay, so we are back for the second session of today with Alex Fergnani. Well, most of you know Alex. He's a PhD candidate in management and organization at the National University of Singapore at the Business School. And he's also an associate editor with the World Futures Review. He's been working a lot during the last years, creating videos on foresight and trying to democratize the different tools and solving issues with the doubts and misconceptions on what foresight is. So he's going to be talking today with us on the resistance to create scientific theory in the futures and foresight field and what we could be doing about that. So Alex, welcome to the Global Foresight Summit. And I leave this on you.
Thanks, Miguel. Such an honor to be here. It is a great pleasure, and I do hope that this short talk will encourage a lot of discussion, as it has done in various platforms over the past few months. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen. I think you should be able to see it right now. So if I don't hear anything, I'm just assuming you see it. So this work is a paper I've written with my mentor and co-author, Professor Thomas Chermack, who is currently a professor of organizational study at Colorado State University. And just a qualification before we start. In this work, we're really talking to a wide and broad community. We're talking both to future studies scholars in academia, as well as foresight practitioners in practice. That's why we actually use the term futures and foresight to define and to talk to the field at large. And as for practitioners, we're really talking to any practitioners in the field, both those who are doing civilizational foresight for communities or government, as well as to those who are doing more corporate-driven foresight for for-profit organizations. Why do we have such a broad approach? Well, that's because the problems we are talking about in this research are really problems that we think are shared among every practitioner and scholar in the broader field of future studies and foresight. So this paper was originally published on the journal Futures and Foresight Science as the resistance to scientific theory in futures and foresight and what to do about it. Now, when we say scientific theory in this paper, we actually mean a very specific and narrow definition of theory. And that definition is the conceptualization of theory according to management and organization, otherwise known as organizational studies or organizational behavior or organizational sciences, which is a discipline of studies oftentimes found in business schools, which studies human being and their behavior in organizational settings. So what does theory mean according to that discipline? Well, according to that discipline, theory is a causal relationship between constructs that represent something in the real world and that is measured with variables. Now, that may sound a bit jargony, so I'm just going to give you an example. For example, a theory of that kind would say, formulate and test that employee dissatisfaction leads to employee turnover intention, meaning that the more an employee in an organization is dissatisfied with his or her job, the more likely that person is to possibly turn to another job, right? Very simple. It's a causal relationship that connects phenomena in the real world. And why do we choose this kind of theory? Why do we draw from this kind of theory and this discipline, this conceptualization of theory? Well, that is because this theory really looks at the behavior of individuals in groups within organizational context. And if you think about it, a lot of the work we do in Futures and Foresight is actually to facilitate outcomes, capabilities, foresight methods, and interventions in groups of individuals. So we're really looking at the same level of analysis, the same context of management and organization. And that is why we draw from this theory, this kind of theory. Now, of course, this is not all what we do in Futures and Foresight, but large majority of what we do is in groups of individuals. So as you can see, this kind of theory is quite different from the grand theories of social change that oftentimes are conceptualized in our field. Actually, what we're talking about here is called mid-range theories. Mid-range theories, it actually is a theory that is tested empirically by collecting data. And the data comes from people, from individuals. And that is why most of mid-range theory is at the individual or organizational level. So just to stress this, because it has been misunderstood when we published this paper, we are not talking about theories about the future or theories about the futures. We are really talking about how Futures and Foresight methods, interventions, capability work in the present in groups of individuals. And we do that with a conceptualization of theory according to management and organization. Now, this is all very good, but how does that apply to our field? Well, let me give you an example. An example of this theory that could apply to our field is formulating the relationship, the causal relationship between scenario planning and individual creativity, in that individuals who have been exposed to scenario planning are actually more creative after they have done it, because scenarios are imaginative and intuitive and creative, and the act of creating scenarios enhances creativity. Now, after having explained what this theory is, we also explain what this theory is not, just to make it clear that a lot of the theories that we call theories in the field of Futures and Foresight actually are different from the theory we are talking about. And all of the items that you see in this list are actually not theory according to management and organization. For example, ontology and epistemologies are not theory. We might talk about the future and say something about whether it can be studied or not, or about the way it could be studied. And those are ontological or epistemological claims, but those are not theories, but because they're not causal in nature. Or, for example, we might describe a foresight methodology and saying that is participatory, but that is not a theory. That is just a description of an attribute of what we do. So all of these things, I'm not going to go into detail on all of those things, but you can imagine these are just the building blocks of theory. They're not really theory according to the description that we provided. And most of all, perhaps the most important item of the list is the last one, speculations. Theories, in our meaning, is not speculations, because speculations might not be tested empirically. We could say scenario planning might increase individuals' creativity, but until that claim is formulated and then tested, it cannot be a theory. So after having explained what the theory is and is not according to management and organization, we also explain how this theory, this kind of theory, can advance over time and usually advances over time. So there are 4 stages of theoretical advancement. In the first stage, we are in a pre-theoretical stage. There is a lot of description and speculations about the things we're studying. In the second stage, we formulate different theoretical claims. In the third stage, we test empirically those claims, and by the nature of empirical validation, some theories are actually preserved because they met the verification of empirical data, and some others are ruled out because they do not. And finally, at the fourth stage, we reach theoretical sophistication, and that means that we add boundary conditions to the theory. Those moderators and mediators that makes a theory more sophisticated and explain why the theory might not actually apply to every context, but only to some context. And this model of theoretical advancement, of course, is a simplification of what happens in the real world of scientific research. Sometimes we don't advance linearly over the 4 stages. Sometimes we go back, right? Because maybe at stage 3 or 4, we realize the theory we had was not completely correct. So we go back to square one, right? Reformulate and retest another theory and then go on. So this is not necessarily linear. It could be iterative. And the same model might not apply to every topic of research within a field, right? There might be some topics that are a bit more advanced and some topics that lag behind a bit more. But on average, in general, this applies to all the disciplines in the social sciences that embrace a conceptualization of theory, which is similar to the one I described, and that is the conceptualization embraced by management and organization. And there are actually a few disciplines that do embrace this conceptualization in the mainstream social science establishment, including most of the disciplines in business schools, including strategy, marketing, international business, and so on, as well as other disciplines in the social sciences outside of business schools, including psychology, public policy, and etc. So if we look at this model, unfortunately, our field is actually stagnating at the first and second stage, right? We have a lot of descriptions about the methods we enact in organizations, some theoretical propositions, but very little third and fourth stage, and that is very little theoretical testing and theoretical sophistication. So how do we advance the theoretical refinement of our field along those 4 stages? Well, we do that by studying the outcomes of futures and foresight interventions, capabilities, and methods. Now, there are a lot of outcomes. I just outlined a few of them here at the organizational level and a few of them at the individual level, but there are many more than these few. So what we ought to do is to actually test, first formulate, and then test whether futures and foresight can enhance all of those things that we think actually are beneficial for individuals and organizations, including learning, creativity, flexibility of mind, and for the organization, innovation, performance, etc. And when we will eventually develop over the 4 stages of the model of theoretical advancement, eventually we also will want to study mediators. Now, mediators are those mechanisms that explain why certain interventions, such as futures and foresight interventions, actually achieve certain outcomes. For example, I'm just giving one example here. It could be arguable that futures and foresight enhances the conversation between individuals in an organization, and because of that, then there is more exchange and more innovation going on. This is just a claim. It's not a theory because I just made it up, right? I didn't test it. But this is just an example to show you what mediation is about. Mediators, such as in this case conversation, explain how and why certain interventions can lead to certain outcomes. And eventually, we might also want to study what is called moderators. Moderators are those individuals or organizational characteristics that actually create the boundary conditions to a theory. For example, it could be arguable that futures and foresight methods are good to enhance innovation in some organizations, but not in others. Or it could be argued that futures and foresight capabilities are good to enhance creativity in individuals, but only for some individuals and not others. So moderators like these actually answer the questions of when, where, and to whom the theory applies. So that's why they're called boundary conditions. And just to make it clear, because this has been widely misunderstood, studying moderators actually allows us to take into account context, right? That is why these theories that I am explaining to you, the kind of theory that I'm explaining to you, is not a universal theory that applies to every concept. We don't want to create universal laws. That's actually unlikely. We actually want and will include context into our theories. Now, you can also do the same, both at the same time, right? We can also, and will eventually want to, study boundary conditions and mediators at the same time. Why is creating this kind of theory so important? Well, two reasons. The first reason is that if we develop and test this kind of theory, we will understand all the mechanisms that we are enacting when we do futures and foresight in organizations. And when I say organizations, it works for every organization, right? It works for communities, governments, for-profit organizations, and so on. So understanding here goes beyond simple mental fun. It's not just as a fun mental activity to understand what we do. It's also useful because, for example, if we understand theoretically how certain futures and foresight interventions or methods are good to achieve certain outcomes rather than others, then we can advise practitioners to use certain methodologies rather than others in their specific context. So understanding what we do is useful not only because it's interesting, but also because it actually can help practitioners. And the second reason why we want to develop this kind of theory is that we will be more established in academia. If we develop this kind of theory, we will literally speak the language of many disciplines in the social sciences, in mainstream social sciences, including most of the disciplines in business schools, as well as public policy, psychology, part of sociology, and so on. And so it's beneficial to us because we can be more legitimized in academia, which doesn't hurt because our discipline, as you might know very well, has been suffering at the fringes of the academic world. Now, this unfortunately has not occurred, and it has not occurred because of a series of barriers, which we explain in the research, in the paper. And this is arguably the crucial component of our argument. We explain the 9 reasons why we think this theoretical development that we talk about has not occurred. Now, I'm just going to go very quickly through these 9 reasons. The first reason is different use of the term theory. And that means that in Futures and Foresight, when we say theory, we actually might talk about epistemology or ontology about the future, but not necessarily about causal mechanisms about the present. So it's a different use of the term theory, and that is in and of itself a resistance to the kind of scientific theory that I just described. The second is lack of training in theory building and theory testing. This means that a lot of Futures and Foresight scholars or practitioners might be trained in Futures and Foresight methods, but they might not be trained in social science research methods. So they do not know how to do this kind of research. The third is misunderstanding of what scientific assessment is. Now, this means that when we evaluate the effectiveness of certain Futures and Foresight methods or interventions in organizations, we often do it in terms of looking at whether they are successful to achieve certain outcomes specific to the organization where we do our Futures and Foresight work. But that does not mean that this process is scientific. Sometimes might not be scientific, might not be rigorous, and might not be actually aimed at creating the kind of theory I just described. The fourth is perhaps the most pernicious, and that is the conflation of predictions about the future with theoretical predictions. This is about the fact that in Futures and Foresight, we have a very negative connotation of the term prediction. And that is why we conflate theoretical predictions with predicting the future. But let me explain in more detail. When we say predict in Futures and Foresight, we resist prediction because we don't want to predict the future. One of the major tenets of Futures and Foresight is that the future is open to be created, and so we study a range of possible futures. So the idea of prediction is actually is considered quite bad in our field. Now, unfortunately, the social sciences also use the word prediction, but that is not to refer to predicting the future, only to refer to predict the outcomes of social science research with statistics. So in our field, we don't know this distinction, and we conflate the two predictions. And unfortunately, we don't do social science research because we think that it predicts the future, but in reality, it just predicts the outcomes of certain statistical models. But in and of itself, this is also a resistance to the theory I just described. The fifth barrier is disinterest in doing science. Well, this is quite intuitive. Because our field is practitioners-driven, which is great, but on the other hand, the side effect of that is that we might not be super interested in actually engaging in scientific research. Barrier 6 and 7 can actually be subsumed to the same sort of cause, and that is we have misplaced epistemological positions against objectively studying phenomena in the real world. Barrier 8, enjoyment of being outliers, is actually quite intuitive as well, because our field is arguably very multidisciplinary and very holistic. So when we look at established disciplines in academia that are oftentimes monodisciplinary, such as psychology, for example, we oftentimes look down on such disciplines because they do not, and we believe they do not understand the larger complexity of the world, and they don't take into account multidisciplinarity, if not transdisciplinarity. So on one hand, we are correct in that we are multidisciplinary, but this has a side effect that we look down on monodisciplinary fields. And finally, the last barrier is the cult of personalities. And this is also rather intuitive. In our field, we have a lot of very famous practitioners, which is a great thing. But oftentimes, the side effect of that is that these practitioners, which are oftentimes worshipped, are also giving off an ideal of success, which is very different from the ideal of success in the sciences, which is a detached observer, the scientist. So that is another, arguably, resistance to the idea of creating scientific theory, because the ideal of success in the sciences is not really pursued in our field. Now, when we posted this list of barriers to scientific theory to various platforms, as you can imagine, this is a rather provocative list. So it created quite a stir in our field. In fact, in the words of a supporter, this research has pointed the finger at some of the sacred cows in our field in a manner that was unprecedented since the decolonizing futures wave in the 1990s. And we were happy because of this, but at the same time, we had a lot of supporters and also a lot of criticism. When we posted this list to the various platforms in our field, and most notably on the listserv of the World Future Studies Federation, the first response we had was, yes, but you are talking about a different kind of theory here. And that response was actually quite easy to overcome, because once we clarified that the kind of theory we were describing is very different from the theory we use in Futures and Foresight, then this response was actually cleared. There wasn't any misunderstanding anymore. Then after that, the discussion started to revolve around more profound issues behind the resistance to scientific theory, and that is barriers 6 and 7. So after the idea of different theories was clarified, it was clear that there were more deeper ideological reasons behind the fact that Futures and Foresight resist the kind of theory that I described. And these are ideological and, if not epistemological, in nature. So let me be more specific. In Futures and Foresight, we embrace a subjective philosophy of science, while on the other hand, the kind of theory that I just describes is embracing an objective philosophy of science. More specifically, in Futures and Foresight, we have a range of philosophies of science that permeate the field, including social constructivism, postmodernism, and postnormal science, arguably also post-structuralism. But on the other hand, in business schools and in the social sciences in general, at least in those departments that I mentioned, we embrace critical realism. And those two camps are actually very different philosophies of science. According to the first camp, reality is constructed by human activities or human language. And according to the second camp, reality is independent of human activity or language, but our interpretations of reality can be fallible. So as you can see, the two camps have a completely, if not opposite, view of what reality is. But our argument is the following. If the first view looks at reality by conflating ontology and epistemology, the second view, which is the one we propose, actually keeps the two separate. So the first view is committing something that has been called epistemic fallacy. What is an epistemic fallacy? Well, an epistemic fallacy is when you conflate an epistemological claim about whether you can study things, and that could be that reality is understood differently by different individuals, with an ontological claims about reality itself, and that could be reality does not exist. So the fact that oftentimes the philosophy of science behind Futures and Foresight claims that since we cannot fully understand reality in the same manner according to individuals, then reality does not exist, actually commits an epistemic fallacy. And that epistemic fallacy prevents us from doing research about the present, and especially about Futures and Foresight interventions, capabilities, and methods about the present. So what's going on here? It seems that the idea that the future is indeterminate, which is correct and good, and that we ought to maintain it, is somehow expanded to the present via this epistemic fallacy, which is not necessarily correct or not necessarily desirable. Now, at this point, you might buy this argument and say, Alex, you're right. In fact, we are committing an epistemic fallacy. We shouldn't conflate epistemology and ontology. So let's study the outcomes of Futures and Foresight research in the present. How to do that? Now, if you buy this argument, the next slide is for you. But if you don't buy this argument and you say, Alex, actually, I still think that reality is dependent on the observer, then the next slide is not for you, all right? So we provide a set of recommendations in three parts: recommendations for authors, recommendations for journal editors, and recommendations for practitioners in order to solve this problem of scientific theory, or better, of resistance to scientific theory in our field. For authors, this is quite simple. We advise to familiarize with theory building and theory testing in the social sciences. And in the original paper, we provide a list of readings to do that. And we also advise authors to look at theory not just, again, as a fan activity, but as an instrument to solve real-world problems. For example, what I like to mention a lot is a theory that would distinguish what Futures and Foresight methods are more aligned to achieve certain outcomes in groups of individuals, which is a theory that has not been developed yet. But I believe that if that were developed, it would be super useful for practitioners as well. It's not just an interesting thing to read, it would be actually useful for those who do Foresight work. As for recommendations for journal editors, we'll simply encourage editors to say it clearly in their journals' manifestos that they welcome theory building and theory testing papers as other disciplines in the social sciences. And finally, as recommendations for practitioners, we encourage them to partner with scientists and to keep abreast of the literature. Now, of course, practitioners might not feel they have a direct interest in developing this kind of theory, but for sure, at least they have an indirect interest in being informed about this theory so that they can improve their practice, and also to promote and support those who create this theory, because indirectly, if there are a lot of scientists who can create this theory and they can create it according to the language of the social sciences in general, then our field will increase. The presence of our field will increase in academia. And if the presence of our field will be increased in academia, more people will be educated about it. And so more practitioners will be asked because there is better demand and higher demand of practitioners. So practitioners also have an indirect interest in promoting this kind of theory, because eventually it will fall back on them if the demand of futures and foresight practitioners is higher in the social environment at large, given that there is more academic output of it. So with this, my short talk has reached the end. I thank you immensely for your attention, and I do welcome any questions or responses. Thank you for your attention.
Hello, Alex. Thank you for the presentation. I'm going to remove the screen from there. Perfect. There are a few questions. I don't know if you can see the screen in there, but I can put them for you on the screen right now. So there you have Imon. He's asking you.
Well, we have lost Miguel for a second, so I'm just going to go on and read this question. You are seeking to establish external validity for claims with respect to the benefits of foresight. In other words, if I understand correctly. Yes, Imon, thanks for your question. So there is a good point you're actually raising here, which is the external validity of the theory I've been explaining, and that is, if I try to reword your question. If we do experiments, for example, or if we study futures and foresight interventions, that might entail doing lab studies, lab experiments, and those might not have external validity. So yes, for sure, that is a challenge, right? That is a challenge, because if we do, for example, an experiment and we get a bunch of students and we assign them to groups, I'm just making it up for illustrative purposes, and one of the group is scenario planning, the other is a control group. Well, that is a very controlled environment, and the findings of that might not be extended to the field work, right? So that's why, for sure, we ought to do experimental studies such as that one, but also we ought to do field studies. And in fact, as practitioners, we have a lot of opportunities to do field studies, because in my experience, I have had a lot of workshops where the organization I'm working with actually agreed on doing some pre-test and post-test surveys just to assess whether the interventions we have enacted in the organization are useful. So there are opportunities for practitioners, again, to partner with scientists, or for futures and foresight scholars to collect data by their interventions in order to create this kind of theory. So yes, to answer your question, we need to be careful about the external validity. And as in other disciplines in the social sciences, we will likely need to do both lab studies in a controlled environment, perhaps to single out certain psychological mechanisms, but also field study, right, to have an ecological validity and to study how the interventions we enact actually affect a group of individuals in the real world. I hope that answers your question. I still don't see Miguel, but I trust you might have another question, so I will take them as they come. Hi, Rocco. Thanks for being here. Glad to see you. Rocco says, building theories in this perspective, it seems to me similar to the activity of participatory modeling, group model building in the field of system thinking, system dynamics. Is it similar? Okay, so I am not familiar, unfortunately, with system thinking and system dynamics, so I don't know how to answer your question. Sorry for that. But what I can say, Rocco, is that this is just one way to enhance theory in our field. So we draw from management and organization, and to be more specific, we draw from the conceptualization of theory in management and organization to advance the field in certain domains of academia. But we also understand that that is our field of expertise, and there might be many other domains that have a stronger footing and a stronger establishment in academia that look at theory in a different manner. So system dynamics could be a great additional discipline to look at and to draw from in order to actually enhance the theoretical foundations of our field in all of the domains of academia. In fact, if you do what I just advised to do, you will have a good response in certain parts of academia and not all of academia. So I think that the same thing that we did could be done with other disciplines, right? We could try to find the commonalities between our field and different fields of study, which have a stronger establishment, a stronger footing in academia, and draw from them. And if we draw from many of them and talk their language, then eventually we will be much more legitimized in academia at large. And on the top of that, if we have different theories, all of which have a strong establishment in the social sciences, to look at the same phenomena, that will be a great incentive to keep studying these phenomena, because it is the debate between different angles to look at one phenomena that actually incentivizes scholar to do more research about it. So totally, we should do more stuff on theory according to system dynamics, on futures and foresight practices and processes. I will just keep moderating and talking at the same time because Miguel is nowhere in sight. So I'm just going to take the question as they come.
Yes.
Christina has another question. How to deal with images of the future? Hey, Miguel. Glad you're back. So yeah, I was taking questions as they come. Christina asks how to deal with images of the future from a workshop setting and how to still convey them as neutrally as possible, as not to add own researcher's perception to the analysis. That's a beautiful question. All right. So I think, Christina, here you're asking two different questions. One is, how do we study images of the future and their effect on individuals? And that is actually a different level of analysis, because what I've been arguing is about studying the outcomes of interventions, and that is scenario planning or causal-layered analysis or other futures and foresight interventions, right? And to study the effect of images of the future, the mere exposure to images of the future, for example, in a society at large, and how they affect individuals, is another level of analysis. So let's just keep that in mind for a second and focus back on the interventions and how to study futures and foresight interventions. Now, your second question, at least the part of your question that to me appears as another or additional component of that, is how do we make sure to avoid researcher bias when we study interventions? For example, if a researcher is trying to develop theory and he or she develops certain methods and research design, and when he or she does facilitate those methods, he or she might also include his or her bias inside the research, right? For sure. There are a number of ways we can fight that risk. A great way to do that is to have control groups, because if we have a control group that are not affected by the foresight facilitator, and the control group also has received also have the same outcome, then it means that the intervention was not useful because there is a treatment effect there. So similar to psychology, we can establish certain control groups to rule out the researcher's bias. Another way to do that is to follow what Roland and Spaniel have written on the journal Futures and Foresight Science in a recent paper on the journal Futures and Foresight Science. And that is, they say that we should have a mixed inquirer and facilitator mode of research. What does it mean to have an inquirer and facilitator mode of research? Well, it simply means that the person who facilitates the workshop is not the person who collects the data and actually analyzes the data. So that way, at least the researcher bias could be partly overcome. And there might be other measures we could take. But yes, that is a concern. Thanks for asking. And we ought to be careful not to inject our own researchers' bias inside the studies.
Okay, Alex, we need to stop here for the next presentation, which is actually me. So that's the reason why I left you a bit more of time, because there were there are very interesting questions. We have Sally Fox with an interesting one, also Alberto Robiati with an interesting one on how to approach a career on the scientific side if you're on Futures and Foresight. So maybe you can take note of those, and those will be very interesting for some of the videos you are doing and creating, because the paper was a little bit of polemic. It has a polemic around that, and it's super nice how you explain that. I strongly believe that theory and validation is needed, and it becomes more a science than an art, which is sometimes what people say, that foresight is more an art than a science, unless it goes into forecasting only. And then you have this conflict in the middle of the forecasting versus foresighting and everything.
Absolutely. Let me say that we are not in any way trying to do a science in foresight, but a science about foresight. So we're not talking about whether the foresight process is scientific. That is completely beyond the scope of this argument. We're talking about creating theory about it that is scientific. So the process can remain creative and artistic and whatever, but you study it, right? You look at it in a scientific manner. So two different levels of analysis.
So thank you so much, Alex. We're going to wrap the presentation here, and everyone else, I will be right back when I set up everything for the next presentation. So see you now, and thank you, Alex.
Thanks, Miguel, and thanks everyone for connecting.